They arrived within 3 years of each other, two franchises that would reshape what horror could mean in gaming. Resident Evil released in Japan on March 22, 1996, for PlayStation, bringing zombies and corporate conspiracies to living rooms across the world. Silent Hill followed on February 23, 1999, in North America, introducing fog-shrouded streets and psychological torment to players who thought they'd seen everything horror games could offer. One franchise gave us biohazard outbreaks and military conspiracies. The other gave us manifestations of guilt and towns that read minds. On the surface, they couldn't be more different. Resident Evil thrived on action beats and survival tactics. Silent Hill built its foundation on atmosphere and emotional devastation. But peel back the surface, look past the fog and the virus samples, and something remarkable emerges. These two titans of survival horror share far more DNA than their surface aesthetics suggest. They learned from each other, borrowed from each other, competed with each other, and ultimately defined the genre together. This is 100 things they have in common, 100 threads connecting mansion corridors to otherworld hospitals, connecting typewriter ribbons to rusted save points, connecting zombies to manifestations of trauma. Some connections are obvious, others run deeper, hidden in game design philosophies and narrative structures that have influenced not just horror games, but gaming as a whole. Let's start with the foundations, the bedrock upon which everything else was built. The PlayStation era defined them both. Both franchises are children of the original PlayStation, that gray console that brought gaming into 3 dimensions and made survival horror technologically possible in ways that previous generations couldn't support. Resident Evil launched as a flagship title, demonstrating what PlayStation hardware could achieve. Silent Hill came later in the console's lifespan, pushing those same technical boundaries in completely different directions. The PlayStation CD-ROM format gave both games something previous cartridge-based systems couldn't provide: storage space for voice acting, full motion video, and most importantly, pre-rendered backgrounds that could display detail far beyond what real-time rendering allowed. Resident Evil used pre-rendered backgrounds to create the Spencer Mansion's elaborate rooms, each frame a carefully composed static image over which 3D character models moved. The technique allowed for stunning visual fidelity at the cost of player-controlled cameras. Silent Hill took a different approach, rendering its environments in real time to enable more dynamic camera movement and that signature fog that masked the hardware's limited draw distance. But both relied fundamentally on PlayStation's capabilities, and both games' aesthetics are inseparable from the platform's technical constraints. The grainy textures, the limited polygons, the fog and darkness that became atmospheric strengths rather than technical weaknesses. All of this defined the visual language of survival horror for a generation. Neither franchise would exist in its original form without PlayStation. The console made them possible, and their success helped establish PlayStation as the dominant gaming platform of its generation. This symbiotic relationship between hardware and software created a perfect storm where technological limitations became creative opportunities, where what the system couldn't do became as important as what it could. They both pioneered survival horror as a genre concept. While games with horror elements existed before 1996, Resident Evil coined the term survival horror and established the genre's core mechanics: limited resources, dangerous enemies you often needed to avoid rather than fight, environmental puzzles blocking progress, safe rooms offering temporary respite. These elements came together in Resident Evil to create a gameplay formula distinct from action games or adventure games. Silent Hill inherited this formula 3 years later but refined it, adding layers of psychological complexity and environmental storytelling that expanded what survival horror could mean. Both games understood that survival horror required a specific balance. Too much combat, and it becomes an action game. Too few threats, and it becomes a walking simulator. Too many puzzles, and it becomes an adventure game. Finding the sweet spot where exploration, combat avoidance, resource management, and puzzle solving coexist in productive tension. That was the achievement both franchises shared. Resident Evil leaned slightly more toward action, Silent Hill toward atmosphere, but both understood they were working within a genre that demanded players feel vulnerable, under-resourced, and uncertain whether running or fighting was the better choice. They also shared an understanding that horror worked best when players had agency. Unlike horror films where viewers passively watch events unfold, survival horror put players in control, making them complicit in the protagonist's choices. When you decide whether to use your last healing item now or save it for later. When you choose to fight a monster or run past it. When you navigate the mansion or the fog-covered streets. These decisions create tension that passive media can't replicate. Both franchises understood this instinctively and built their game designs around empowering players while simultaneously making them feel powerless. The impact of this genre creation rippled outward. Dead Space, The Last of Us, Alien, Isolation, Outlast, and countless others owe their existence to the survival horror framework Resident Evil and Silent Hill established. Even games outside the horror genre borrowed mechanics these franchises pioneered. The safe room concept appears in action games now. Limited inventory management influenced RPGs and looter shooters. Environmental storytelling through documents and audio logs became ubiquitous across gaming. The influence is so pervasive it's nearly invisible, woven into the fabric of game design itself. Fixed and limited camera perspectives dominated both. Resident Evil's pre-rendered backgrounds necessitated fixed camera angles. You couldn't control the camera because you weren't looking at a 3D space. You were looking at a 2D image of a 3D space. The camera cut between preset positions as you moved through rooms, creating a cinematic quality, but also the infamous tank controls, where characters moved relative to their own orientation rather than the camera's perspective. This could be disorienting when cameras changed mid-corridor, but it also created tension. You couldn't see what was around corners. Rooms could hide threats just off-screen. The camera became a tool for building suspense. Silent Hill used real-time 3D environments, allowing for more dynamic camera movement, but still employed limited camera control. The game used cinematic angles, pulling back to show environments from dramatic perspectives, creating a sense that some external force was watching the player character. Sometimes the camera would soar overhead, showing Harry Mason as a tiny figure dwarfed by urban architecture. Other times, it would drop low, making the street ahead impossible to see. These choices weren't just aesthetic. They were narrative tools suggesting that Silent Hill itself was watching, framing, observing. Both franchises eventually moved toward player-controlled cameras in later entries, particularly when technology improved and player expectations shifted. Resident Evil 4 introduced the over-the-shoulder perspective that became industry standard. Silent Hill, the room experimented with first-person elements, but those original fixed and limited camera perspectives weren't just technical necessities. They were artistic choices that shaped how players experienced these worlds. The camera was a narrator, selecting what you could and couldn't see, building tension through framing and composition. Modern remakes of both franchises have struggled with this element. When you give players a fully controllable camera, you lose some of the cinematic framing that made the originals distinctive. The Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes adopted the over-the-shoulder view from RE4, sacrificing the fixed cameras but gaining modern playability. The Silent Hill 2 remake kept the original's camera philosophy but modernized its execution. These decisions highlight how central camera perspective was to each franchise's identity. Changing it fundamentally alters the experience, for better or worse depending on what you value. Tank controls defined early character movement. Tank controls became shorthand for the movement scheme both franchises employed in their early entries. Push up on the controller and your character moves forward relative to their current facing direction, not relative to the camera. Push left or right and they turn in place rather than strafing. This made sense with fixed camera angles. If the camera changed while you held up, you didn't want your character suddenly moving in a different direction mid-stride. Tank controls kept movement consistent regardless of camera position. Players either loved or hated this system. Advocates argued it created tension, making you commit to movements rather than allowing twitchy, responsive action game controls. Critics found it clunky and frustrating, especially during combat when you needed to turn to face enemies before you could move toward or away from them. Both perspectives had merit. Tank controls did create tension. Combat became scarier when you couldn't easily dodge and weave. But they also introduced artificial difficulty disconnected from the horror itself. Resident Evil maintained tank controls through multiple sequels. Code Veronica, Resident Evil 0, even the GameCube remake of the first game kept the scheme because it was synonymous with the franchise. Silent Hill used similar controls in its first 3 games, though some argued the controls felt slightly more fluid because of the real-time 3D environments. The debate raged in gaming forums for years. Were tank controls essential to survival horror, or were they just outdated control schemes that aged poorly? The answer came when Resident Evil 4 abandoned tank controls for a more responsive, over-the-shoulder system, and the game became more commercially successful than any previous entry while maintaining its horror atmosphere. Silent Hill 4. The Room introduced first-person segments with completely different controls. Both franchises proved that you could modernize movement without losing the horror. The tension came from enemy design, resource management, and atmosphere, not specifically from clunky controls. But those tank control era games retained passionate defenders who argued the stiffness was part of the aesthetic, part of what made those games feel distinctive and tense in ways modern games can't replicate. Inventory management created constant resource anxiety. Limited inventory space became a defining survival horror mechanic for both franchises. In Resident Evil, you could only carry a handful of items, maybe 6 or 8 depending on the character. Every weapon, every box of ammunition, every healing herb or first aid spray took up a slot. Finding a useful item meant making hard choices. Do I drop these shotgun shells to pick up this key? Do I combine these healing items now, or wait until I have more? Should I backtrack to a save room and use the item box, losing time but gaining inventory space? Silent Hill's inventory worked differently in specifics, but similarly in principle. You had limited carrying capacity, though generally more generous than Resident Evil's punishing restrictions. The radio took a permanent slot. Your flashlight occupied space. Weapons and healing items competed with puzzle objects and keys. The game rarely forced inventory crises the way Resident Evil did, but the limited space still created tension and forced planning. You couldn't collect everything you found. Choices mattered. Both franchises used inventory management to reinforce vulnerability and scarcity. If you could carry unlimited items, you'd never feel under-resourced. Limited inventory meant you couldn't hoard solutions to every problem. It forced you to specialize, carry more weapons and ammo, or carry more healing items. Focus on puzzle-solving tools or combat preparedness. The inventory screen became a mini-game in itself, arranging items into optimal configurations, combining things to free space, strategizing what to keep and what to store or discard. The item box in Resident Evil became iconic, a magical storage system where items deposited in one box appeared in all boxes, defying physics but providing essential infrastructure. Silent Hill had no equivalent, which created different problems. You couldn't store items anywhere, so if you were carrying puzzle objects you no longer needed, you were just wasting slots. Resident Evil's item boxes created strategic decisions about what to keep accessible and what to store. Silent Hill's lack of storage meant every decision was potentially permanent. Drop something and you might never find it again. Modern survival horror games still wrestle with inventory management. Some maintain strict limits to preserve tension. Others have moved toward more generous systems, arguing that inventory Tetris isn't inherently scary, it's just inconvenient. Both Resident Evil and Silent Hill have experimented across their sequels, with some entries maintaining harsh restrictions and others loosening the reins. The debate continues because inventory management sits at the intersection of mechanical challenge and thematic expression. When it works, it makes you feel vulnerable and resourceful simultaneously. Safe rooms provided essential breathing space. Safe rooms were sacred. In Resident Evil, certain rooms, marked by specific music, often containing typewriters and item boxes, were guaranteed enemy-free zones. Zombies couldn't follow you inside. Hunters couldn't break down the door. Once you entered a safe room, you were genuinely safe, at least temporarily. This created a rhythm to gameplay, tension building as you explored dangerous areas, relief flooding in when you reached a safe room, then the psychological difficulty of leaving safety to venture back into hostile environments. Silent Hill employed the same concept through save points marked by red squares in the first game and notebooks or other objects in sequels. These locations, often accompanied by that melancholic music box melody, offered respite. You could save your progress without consuming resources. No enemies would disturb you. The game gave you permission to breathe, to collect yourself, to plan your next moves without immediate threat. The genius of safe rooms lay in their psychological impact. By creating guaranteed safe spaces, both franchises made everywhere else feel more dangerous by contrast. The relief of reaching safety heightened the tension of leaving it. Good horror understands that constant threat becomes numbing. You need valleys to make peaks effective. Safe rooms were valleys, moments of peace that made the peaks of danger more impactful when they arrived. Both franchises occasionally violated their own rules about safe rooms, creating moments of horror through betrayal of trust. Resident Evil 3 had Nemesis crash through what you thought was a safe area. Silent Hill occasionally revealed that safety was temporary or conditional. These violations were carefully deployed for maximum impact. Break the safe room rule too often, and players stop trusting the spaces, which paradoxically reduces tension because there's nowhere left to feel truly secure. The safe room aesthetic became iconic for both franchises. Resident Evil's save room music, that gentle, Melancholic piano melody became Pavlovian comfort. Silent Hill's save point themes carried similar emotional weight. Both games understood that safe rooms needed their own identity, distinct from the horror environment surrounding them. The audio design, the lighting, even the camera angles in these spaces conveyed safety, creating a stark contrast with the danger lurking just outside. Environmental puzzles gated progress naturally. Locked doors and puzzle boxes weren't just obstacles. They were pacing mechanisms that forced players to explore thoroughly, engage with environments, and experience story beats at controlled intervals. Resident Evil filled the Spencer mansion with elaborate puzzles. Find 3 crests to open a door, solve a chess-based riddle to access a new wing, manipulate paintings and statues to reveal hidden passages. These puzzles rarely made realistic sense. What kind of mansion requires solving riddles just to move between rooms? But they served essential gameplay functions. Silent Hill's puzzles were similarly elaborate but often carried more thematic weight. School puzzles involved childish logic and fairy tales. Hospital puzzles referenced medical procedures and anatomy. Hotel puzzles reflected memory and loss. The puzzles weren't arbitrary. They connected to the locations and the psychological states of characters. A piano puzzle in the school made sense. Students practiced there. A combination lock requiring knowledge of a poem Alessa heard made sense. Her memories shaped the other world. Both franchises used puzzles to control pacing, ensuring players couldn't rush through areas without engaging with environmental details. Finding the puzzle components required thorough exploration. Solving the puzzles required attention to documents, inspection of objects, and sometimes just trial and error experimentation. This forced players to spend time in each location, absorbing atmosphere and building tension before moving forward. The puzzle difficulty varied between games and between franchises. Resident Evil's puzzles ranged from obvious to obscure, with some requiring careful reading of scattered documents and others demanding keen observation of environmental details. Silent Hill generally featured more cryptic puzzles, with solutions requiring interpretation of poetry, religious symbolism, or abstract logic. Multiple difficulty settings often applied to puzzles separately from combat, acknowledging that players might want challenging combat with straightforward puzzles, or vice versa. Both franchises received criticism when puzzles became too obtuse, or when solutions felt arbitrary. Silent Hill 3's Shakespeare puzzle stumped players who weren't literature scholars. Resident Evil's occasional use of nonsensical riddles frustrated people seeking internal consistency. But at their best, environmental puzzles in both franchises served multiple purposes. They gated content to control pacing, they rewarded exploration and attention to detail, they provided breaks from combat tension, and they made environments feel more real through the density of interactive details. Documents and collectibles delivered environmental storytelling. Scattered throughout both franchises were documents, notes, diaries, reports, newspaper clippings, memos that told stories adjacent to the main narrative. In Resident Evil, these documents revealed the history of the Spencer Mansion, detailed Umbrella Corporation's experiments, chronicled the degradation of the researchers as the T-virus spread, and provided puzzle hints. Some were strictly functional, others purely atmospheric, but collectively they painted a picture of what happened before the player character arrived. Silent Hill used similar techniques but with more emphasis on psychological revelation. Documents might be real memories, hallucinated manifestations, or something in between. A diary entry in a hospital might detail a patient's treatment or might be a manifestation of guilt taking written form. The ambiguity was intentional. In a town that reshaped reality based on psychology, how could you trust that documents were objective records rather than subjective projections? Both franchises understood that environmental storytelling through documents allowed for world building without disrupting gameplay. You could deliver exposition without lengthy cutscenes. Players who wanted to understand the full story could collect and read every document. Players who just wanted the core narrative could ignore optional text. This created a two-tier narrative structure, the surface story told through cutscenes and direct gameplay, and the deeper story revealed through optional environmental details. The writing quality of these documents varied. Resident Evil became infamous for awkward translations and stiff prose, with memos written in ways no human would actually write. Silent Hill generally featured more naturalistic writing, with documents that felt like real diary entries or medical reports. Both franchises improved their document writing over time as development teams gained experience and translation quality improved. Collectibles expanded beyond documents and later entries. Resident Evil added files, photos, and audio recordings. Silent Hill included drawings, photographs, and audio tapes. The principle remained the same: scatter pieces of story throughout the environment for attentive players to discover, rewarding exploration and close attention to environmental details. This technique influenced countless games across genres, becoming standard practice for delivering backstory and world building without forcing it on players who don't want exposition dumps. Multiple endings encourage replayability and player agency. Resident Evil pioneered multiple endings based on player choices and performance. Save both Chris and Jill, and they escape together. Let one die, and the ending changes. Complete the game fast enough, and you get a better ending. These weren't branching narrative trees with different story developments. They were variations on the same core ending, but the variations created incentive to replay and try to achieve the best ending. Silent Hill elevated this concept into art. Silent Hill 2 famously had 6 possible endings depending on how James behaved throughout the game. Did you examine Mary's photo repeatedly? Did you heal yourself when wounded or run around at low health? Did you listen to headphones in one specific room? These factors determined which ending you received, with each ending offering different interpretations of James's psychological state and moral resolution. Multiple endings served several purposes. They created replayability. Why play through again if the ending would be identical? They allowed players to feel agency over outcomes, even when most story beats remained fixed. They let developers explore different thematic conclusions, without committing to one canon interpretation. Silent Hill 2's multiple endings worked because each felt valid. Each offered a different lens for understanding James's journey. Some endings were clearly better than others in moral or emotional terms. The Leave ending in Silent Hill 2 offered something resembling redemption. The In Water ending suggested suicide. Neither was more correct, but they carried different emotional weight and implied different interpretations of the preceding events. Resident Evil's multiple endings were generally more clearly ranked. Saving both characters and escaping fast was objectively the best outcome. Both franchises occasionally struggled with implementing multiple endings in ways that felt organic rather than mechanical. When endings depend on arcane factors players couldn't reasonably track, examining a photo a certain number of times, using healing items above or below certain thresholds, it can feel arbitrary rather than meaningful. The best implementations made endings feel like natural consequences of how you played. The worst made them feel like hidden checklists you couldn't complete without a strategy guide. Combat was clunky, difficult, and intentionally restrictive. Neither franchise made combat feel empowering, and that was the point. In action games, combat is where you flex your skills and feel powerful. In survival horror, combat is a resource drain you want to avoid when possible. Resident Evil's combat involved tank controls making it difficult to dodge, limited ammunition forcing careful shot placement, and enemies that took surprising amounts of damage to put down. Zombies could tank multiple pistol shots before dying. Hunters could decapitate you in one attack. Combat was dangerous, costly, and something you often chose to avoid. Silent Hill made its protagonists even less combat capable. Harry Mason was a writer, not a soldier. His attacks were slow, his aim was terrible, his melee swings were clumsy. Combat in Silent Hill wasn't about skill or power fantasy. It was about desperate survival using inadequate tools. The radio warned you when enemies were near, giving you the option to avoid them entirely. Running past enemies was often the smart choice because ammunition was scarce and fighting was risky. The restrictive nature of combat served thematic purposes. These weren't action heroes. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary horror. Making combat difficult and costly reinforced vulnerability and forced players to think tactically. Every bullet mattered. Every fight was a calculated risk. This distinguished survival horror from action games where combat was the primary gameplay loop rather than a dangerous option of last resort. Boss battles were exceptions where combat became unavoidable, testing whether you'd conserved enough resources and learned enough about enemy patterns to prevail. Resident Evil boss fights were typically more action-oriented, with clear attack patterns and strategies. Silent Hill boss fights were often more abstract, with some fights feeling less like tests of combat skill and more like endurance challenges or puzzle-like encounters requiring specific approaches. Later entries in both franchises would wrestle with this balance. Resident Evil 4 made combat more fluid and responsive, with higher enemy counts and more action game pacing. Some fans loved the increased focus on combat. Others felt it lost survival horror's vulnerability. Silent Hill Homecoming added God of War-style combat with dodge rolls and counterattacks, which some felt made the combat too competent, undermining the series' emphasis on powerlessness. The ongoing debate reflected genuine tension in survival horror design. Make combat too difficult, and it becomes frustrating. Make it too easy, and it loses tension. Limited saving systems created meaningful stakes. Resident Evil's ink ribbon system became infamous. Save points were everywhere, typewriters in safe rooms throughout the Spencer mansion, but using them required consuming an ink ribbon from your limited supply. This created agonizing decisions. Do I save now after making significant progress, or do I conserve the ribbon and risk losing progress if I die? How confident am I that I can reach the next safe room? How much progress am I willing to potentially lose? Silent Hill took the opposite approach. Save points were unlimited and free. You could save constantly without penalty. This seemed like it would reduce tension. If death has no stakes, why fear it? But Silent Hill compensated by making save points less frequent than Resident Evil's. You couldn't save anywhere. You needed to find specific locations marked by red squares or notebooks. The game still created tension about whether to backtrack to the last save point or push forward, hoping you'd find another soon. Both approaches worked by making saving a strategic consideration rather than an automatic action. Resident Evil made saving costly, forcing you to weigh current security against future resources. Silent Hill made saving logistically challenging, forcing you to weigh the time cost of backtracking against the risk of losing progress. Neither let you save anywhere, anytime, which meant death carried meaningful consequences. Modern survival horror often allows autosaves at checkpoints or unlimited manual saving, acknowledging that replaying sections due to not saving isn't inherently scary, it's just frustrating. But both Resident Evil and Silent Hill's save systems worked in their context because they reinforced the core loop of risk assessment and strategic planning. Saving became another resource to manage, another decision with consequences. Some players absolutely hated limited saving, viewing it as artificial difficulty that wasted time without adding genuine challenge. Others found it essential to creating tension, arguing that without meaningful death penalties, players took foolish risks knowing they could just reload. The debate continues with modern games split between harsh saving restrictions and generous checkpoint systems. Real-time 3D versus pre-rendered backgrounds created distinct aesthetics. The technical choice between real-time 3D environments and pre-rendered backgrounds shaped how each franchise looked and felt. Resident Evil used pre-rendered backgrounds, essentially 2D paintings over which 3D character models moved. This allowed spectacular visual detail impossible in real-time rendering on PlayStation hardware. The mansion's rooms could have intricate textures, complex lighting, and visual density that real-time engines couldn't match. The trade-off was fixed camera angles and the disconnect between background quality and character model quality. Silent Hill rendered everything in real-time 3D, which meant more freedom in camera movement and more dynamic interaction possibilities but lower overall visual fidelity. The fog that became Silent Hill's signature aesthetic choice was partially a clever workaround for the PlayStation's limited draw distance. If you couldn't render distant objects without massive slowdown, just hide them in fog and make the limitation atmospheric. Both approaches had strengths. Pre-rendered backgrounds could be stunning, with artists able to control lighting and composition for each fixed view. Real-time 3D enabled more dynamic experiences, with changing lighting, weather effects, and camera angles that could move fluidly. Resident Evil's aesthetic felt more like moving through a series of paintings. Silent Hills felt more like exploring a cohesive 3D space. Later games would blur this distinction as technology improved. Resident Evil 4 finally moved to real-time 3D rendering while maintaining visual quality that rivaled earlier pre-rendered backgrounds. Silent Hill maintained its real-time approach while dramatically improving fidelity. But those original technical choices left lasting imprints on each franchise's visual identity and influenced how subsequent games balance visual quality against technical limitations. Both franchises featured ordinary protagonists, thrust into horror. Neither franchise made action heroes their protagonists, at least not initially. Resident Evil starred special police unit members, trained, yes, but not superhuman. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine were competent professionals, but the horror came from facing threats beyond their training. They weren't prepared for zombies and bioorganic weapons. Their skills helped them survive, but didn't make survival easy or guaranteed. Silent Hill went further in the ordinary person direction. Harry Mason was a writer searching for his daughter. James Sunderland was a bereaved husband answering a letter. Heather was a teenager. These weren't people with combat trainings or tactical experience. They swung pipes and fired guns like amateurs because they were amateurs. Their ordinariness made the horror more relatable. These could be anyone, could be you. The choice to use ordinary protagonists served important purposes. It made the player identification stronger, easier to imagine yourself in the protagonist's place when they're not trained soldiers or action heroes. It justified the clunky combat and limited resources. Of course, an ordinary person struggles against supernatural horrors. It created vulnerability that action hero protagonists couldn't provide. Later entries in both franchises would complicate this. Resident Evil eventually gave us Leon Kennedy post-special agent training, Chris Redfield after becoming a boulder-punching action hero, and other protagonists with progressively more combat competence. Silent Hill maintained its ordinary protagonist approach longer, though games like Homecoming and Downpour featured protagonists with military backgrounds. The shift toward more capable protagonists often coincided with shifts toward more action-oriented gameplay. Boss battles provided punctuation points in the horror narrative. Boss encounters in both franchises served as climactic moments where story and gameplay intersected. These weren't just tougher enemies, they were narrative crescendos, often representing thematic concepts or character development. Resident Evil's boss fights tested whether you'd manage resources well and learned enemy patterns. Silent Hill's boss fights often symbolize psychological breakthroughs or confrontations with repressed trauma. Resident Evil bosses range from realistic threats like giant snakes and sharks to science fiction monstrosities like tyrants and mutated Umbrella executives. The fights typically had clear patterns. Learn when to dodge, when to shoot, exploit specific weaknesses. They felt like video game boss fights in the traditional sense, with defined stages and strategies for victory. Silent Hill bosses were more abstract. The split head in the school represented duality and split consciousness. The flesh lips in the hospital echoed themes of consumption and grotesque transformation. Pyramid Head wasn't even primarily a boss. He appeared throughout Silent Hill 2 as an executioner figure, and your few combat encounters with him weren't meant to be won in traditional terms. Both franchises use boss battles to provide closure to major locations or story beats. Defeating a boss often meant you were done with that area, creating a sense of progression and accomplishment. The boss acted as a gatekeeper, and victory allowed you to move forward both geographically and narratively. Some Silent Hill boss fights were criticized for being tedious rather than scary. Bullet sponge enemies requiring repetitive shooting without interesting mechanics. Some Resident Evil boss fights were criticized for being more frustrating than challenging, with instant kill attacks or poorly communicated strategies. But at their best, boss battles in both franchises provided memorable set-piece moments that punctuated the horror experience with focused combat encounters. Transformation sequences showed reality breaking down. Both franchises employed transformation sequences where familiar environments became nightmarish versions of themselves. In Silent Hill, this was codified as the transition between the fog world and the other world. An air raid siren would wail, and the town would transform, walls becoming rust-covered metal, floors turning to grating, blood and barbed wire appearing everywhere. The transformation was the town's true nature revealing itself, or perhaps reality reshaping based on the protagonist's psychological state. Resident Evil used transformation more sparingly, but no less effectively. The mansion itself was relatively stable, but discovering secret passages and hidden laboratories revealed the mundane facade hiding horrible reality. The mansion wasn't what it seemed. Beneath the ordinary surface lurked experimentation chambers and biohazard containment areas. Later games made these transformations more dramatic, with areas becoming more destroyed or corrupted as the plot progressed. The transformation concept served to keep environments from becoming too familiar. Just when you thought you'd learned an area, Silent Hill would shift it into the other world, requiring re-navigation and creating renewed tension. Resident Evil's transformations were usually one-time reveals, but served similar purpose. The environment you thought you knew had hidden depths and terrors. These transformations also served thematic purposes. In Silent Hill, the other world represented psychological truth breaking through everyday reality. The rust and decay visualized corruption and trauma. In Resident Evil, discovering the mansion's true nature as a cover for illegal experimentation revealed the horror hiding behind corporate respectability. Fog and darkness masked technical limitations beautifully. Both franchises used environmental conditions to hide technical constraints while creating atmosphere. Silent Hill's signature fog wasn't originally an artistic choice. It was a technical necessity. The PlayStation couldn't render the entire town without crippling frame rate drops, so the developers hid distant geometry in thick fog, drastically reducing what needed to be rendered at any moment. What started as a workaround became the franchise's defining aesthetic element, creating an atmosphere of claustrophobia and uncertainty even in outdoor spaces. Resident Evil used darkness and fixed camera angles to similar effect. Pre-rendered backgrounds meant they didn't need to render environments in real time, but character models and enemies still required processing power. Dark lighting meant fewer expensive lighting calculations, fewer details requiring rendering. Darkness also limited sight lines in ways that built tension. What you couldn't see remained threatening. Both franchises turned these limitations into atmospheric strengths. Fog made Silent Hill feel suffocating and unknowable. You could only see a few feet ahead, making navigation dangerous and disorienting. Darkness made Resident Evil's mansion feel oppressive and dangerous. Rooms were often dimly lit with dramatic shadows, creating uncertainty about what might be lurking in the corners. Later games maintained fog and darkness even when technical constraints no longer demanded them, because these elements had become integral to each franchise's identity. Silent Hill without fog felt wrong. Resident Evil without dramatic lighting felt wrong. What began as technical necessities became aesthetic choices that defined the franchise's visual languages. Corporate conspiracy and hidden experiments drove both narratives. Umbrella Corporation became synonymous with evil pharmaceutical companies conducting illegal experiments. The T-virus, the G-virus, bioorganic weapons research, all of it drove Resident Evil's plot. The experiments created the zombies and monsters. The cover-ups created the conspiracy. The corporate structure meant layers of responsibility and deniability, with executives and researchers at odds, private military contractors following immoral orders, and innocent people caught in the crossfire. Silent Hill's order cult served similar narrative function, though with different aesthetic. Where Umbrella represented corporate greed and scientific hubris, the Order represented religious fanaticism and occult ambition. Both organizations conducted experiments on unwilling subjects. Both pursued godhood or ultimate power through morally bankrupt means. Both created monsters and suffering in pursuit of their goals. These overarching antagonist organizations provided context for the immediate horrors. The zombies and bioweapons weren't random. They were created deliberately. The otherworld and its manifestations weren't arbitrary. They resulted from the Order's rituals and the town's dark history. Having institutional antagonists meant the horror had origins, purposes, and human agents responsible for setting events in motion. The conspiracy elements also provided mystery and revelations to drive narrative progression, discovering Umbrella's true purpose, uncovering the extent of their experiments, learning about specific viral strains and their development. These revelations punctuated Resident Evil's story. Similarly, learning about the Order's history, discovering their methods, understanding their goals, these drove Silent Hill's narrative forward. Sound design created unsettling atmospheres through minimalism. Audio design in both franchises understood that silence and subtle sounds often created more tension than constant noise. Resident Evil used ambient sounds sparingly, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, distant moans of zombies, the click of doors opening. The Spencer mansion felt oppressively quiet, making every sound stand out. When music did play, it was often unsettling strings or ominous brass rather than melodic themes. Silent Hill took this further with Akira Yamaoka's industrial soundscapes. The games often featured no music at all, just ambient environmental sounds, wind through empty streets, distant metallic scraping, the static of the radio. When music appeared, it was frequently dissonant and abstract, using industrial percussion and processed sounds rather than traditional instrumentation. The result was deeply unsettling in ways that conventional horror scores couldn't achieve. Both franchises used the radio or similar alert systems to create audio-based tension. Resident Evil's enemies often made distinct sounds before appearing on screen. Zombie moans, hunter, screeches, dog growls. This gave players warning, but also created dread, knowing something was coming without seeing it yet. Silent Hill's radio crackled with static when enemies were near, creating similar anticipatory tension. The save room music in both franchises provided crucial contrast. Resident Evil's save room theme was gentle and melancholic, creating Pavlovian relief when you entered safe spaces. Silent Hill's save point music carried similar emotional weight, signaling that you could breathe, at least temporarily. These audio cues help define the rhythm of play. Tension, relief, tension, relief. Multiple playthroughs unlocked rewards and new content. Both franchises encouraged replaying through unlockable rewards. Complete Resident Evil, and you might unlock infinite ammo weapons, alternate costumes, or new game modes. Finish fast enough and you'd get special items like rocket launchers with unlimited ammunition. These rewards made subsequent playthroughs easier and more experimental. With infinite ammo, you could fight instead of avoiding enemies, changing the gameplay experience dramatically. Silent Hill offered similar incentives. Complete the game and unlock alternate outfits, joke weapons, or special items that appear in subsequent runs. The UFO endings and other joke endings provided comedy relief after the psychological trauma of the serious endings. Some weapons and items only appeared in New Game Plus, rewarding multiple playthroughs with expanded options. These unlock systems served several purposes. They increased replay value. Why play through again if nothing changes? They allowed players to experiment with different playstyles, using more aggressive tactics, with infinite ammo, or trying self-imposed challenges with limited resources. They rewarded mastery, giving players who learned the games well tangible benefits. Both franchises also used ranking systems that graded player performance. Complete the game in under a certain time, use minimal saves, achieve high accuracy. These factors determined your rank, with higher ranks unlocking better rewards. The ranking system appealed to completionists, and speedrunners, creating additional challenge beyond simply finishing the story. Sequels built on original formulas while evolving gameplay. Neither franchise stood still after their first entries. Resident Evil 2 expanded the formula with larger environments, more complex narratives, and refined mechanics. Resident Evil 3 added the dodge mechanic and the Nemesis pursuer. Code Veronica brought the series to Dreamcast with improved graphics and more complex storytelling. Each sequel iterated on the core formula while maintaining the essential elements that made the original work. Silent Hill 2 is often considered the franchise peak, taking the original's psychological horror and deepening it into a meditation on grief, guilt, and sexual frustration. Silent Hill 3 connected directly to the first game's storyline while refining gameplay. Silent Hill 4, The Room experimented with apartment-based horror and first-person segments. Each sequel explored different aspects of horror while maintaining the franchise's core identity. Both series struggled when they strayed too far from their origins. Resident Evil 6 tried to be everything to everyone: action game, horror game, cinematic blockbuster, and satisfied few. Silent Hill's Western-developed entries like Homecoming and Downpour struggled to capture what made the series special. The most successful entries balanced innovation with respect for core design philosophies. This evolutionary approach kept both franchises relevant across multiple console generations. Rather than endlessly remaking the first game, both series explored different settings, different characters, different gameplay variations. Some experiments worked better than others, but the willingness to evolve prevented stagnation while the commitment to core principles prevented complete identity loss. Remake and remaster cycles brought classic entries to new audiences. Both franchises have extensive remake and remaster histories, bringing older games to new platforms with updated graphics and refined mechanics. Resident Evil received a stunning GameCube remake in 2002, completely rebuilding the Spencer Mansion with gorgeous pre-rendered backgrounds, revised puzzles, and new mechanics like defensive weapons. That remake was later remastered for HD platforms, bringing it to new audiences again. The Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes from 2019 and 2020 completely reimagined the original games with over-the-shoulder perspective, modern graphics, and streamlined design. These weren't simple graphical upgrades. They were full reimaginings that maintained the original spirit while modernizing everything for contemporary audiences. The remakes achieved both critical and commercial success, proving that classic survival horror could still resonate with modern players. Silent Hill 2 received a comprehensive remake in 2024 from Bloober Team, rebuilding the game with modern graphics, while maintaining the original's atmosphere and psychological complexity. The remake demonstrated that Silent Hill's appeal transcended its original PlayStation 2 presentation. The core narrative and emotional resonance remained powerful, even in updated form. These remakes and remasters served multiple purposes. They introduced classic games to players who couldn't access original hardware. They preserved gaming history, keeping important titles playable and available. They let developers revisit and refine old ideas with modern tools, fixing problems that technical limitations once forced them to accept. And they kept franchises commercially viable during periods when new entries weren't in development. The Resident Evil films and Silent Hill films expanded beyond gaming. Both franchises spawned live-action film adaptations with varying degrees of success and faithfulness to source material. The Resident Evil film series, beginning in 2002, became the highest-grossing video game film franchise despite bearing little resemblance to the games. Paul W.S. Anderson's films focused on original character Alice and increasingly diverged from game continuity, prioritizing action spectacle over horror atmosphere. Silent Hill's 2006 film adaptation, directed by Christophe Gans, was more faithful to the game's aesthetic and psychological horror approach. While it condensed and altered storylines, the film captured much of what made the games distinctive: the fog, the otherworld transformations, the symbolic monsters, the oppressive atmosphere. It wasn't universally beloved by fans, but it attempted to translate the game's essence to film in ways Resident Evil's adaptations rarely tried. Both film franchises demonstrated the challenges of adapting survival horror games to cinema. Games create horror through player agency, resource management, and pacing that films can't replicate. What works as tense gameplay doesn't necessarily translate to watchable cinema. Resident Evil's films opted for action movie spectacle, acknowledging that watching someone carefully manage inventory and solve puzzles isn't exciting cinema. Silent Hill tried to maintain the game's atmospheric horror, but struggled with pacing and exposition. The film's existence demonstrated both franchises' cultural penetration beyond gaming. They introduced the properties to audiences who never played the games, creating awareness that potentially drove game sales. They also proved that video game adaptations remain challenging. Even beloved franchises struggled to translate effectively to film. Merchandise and media expanded both franchises beyond core games. Both franchises spawned extensive merchandise and transmedia expansions. Resident Evil comics explored storylines between games. Novels filled narrative gaps. Animated films provided additional canon content. Merchandise ranging from action figures to clothing brought franchise iconography into the physical world. The transmedia approach built engaged fan communities and kept franchises relevant between major game releases. Silent Hill similarly expanded beyond games, though less extensively than Resident Evil. Comics explored additional storylines. Novels adapted and expanded game narratives. Art books and guidebooks provided insight into creature design and world building. The franchise's cult status meant merchandise was more limited, but no less passionate, with fans treasuring rare collectibles. These expansions served multiple purposes beyond simple revenue. They kept franchises in public consciousness during development gaps between games. They allowed deeper exploration of lore and backstory than games could accommodate. They built engaged fan communities sharing enthusiasm across media formats, and they demonstrated that both franchises had cultural impact beyond their original medium. Psychological horror versus action horror created distinct identities. While both franchises occupied the survival horror genre, they approached horror differently. Resident Evil leaned toward action horror, zombies lunging from shadows, hunters leaping across rooms, lickers crawling on ceilings. The threats were visceral and immediate. The horror came from physical danger, from resource scarcity, making you vulnerable to very real monsters trying to kill you. Silent Hill leaned towards psychological horror, manifestations of guilt and trauma, symbolic monsters representing repressed emotions, environments that might be hallucinated rather than real. The horror came from uncertainty about what was real, from facing externalized versions of internal demons, from the realization that the town was showing you your own darkness. This distinction shaped everything about the franchises. Resident Evil's monsters were biological, products of viruses and genetic manipulation, explained through pseudo-scientific lore. Silent Hill's monsters were psychological, products of minds and spiritual power, explained through symbolism and metaphor. Resident Evil's environments were corrupt but real, labs and mansions suffering outbreaks. Silent Hill's environments were subjective, shaped by the protagonist's psychology, potentially hallucinated. Both approaches had strengths. Action horror provided clear threats with comprehensible rules. Psychological horror provided ambiguity that lingered after the game ended. Resident Evil created tension through resource management and combat difficulty. Silent Hill created tension through atmosphere and emotional devastation. Neither approach was superior. They were different tools for different types of horror. Both franchises influenced countless other horror games. The impact of Resident Evil and Silent Hill rippled across the gaming industry. Dead Space took Resident Evil's over-the-shoulder perspective and resource management into science fiction horror. The Last of Us combined Resident Evil's scarcity and stealth with narrative-driven character development. Outlast took survival, horror's vulnerability, and removed combat entirely, creating hide-and-seek terror. Silent Hill's influence appeared in games like Alan Wake, which used similar fog aesthetics and psychological mystery. The Evil Within blended Resident Evil's gameplay with Silent Hill's surrealism. Layers of Fear explored psychological horror and unreliable environments directly inspired by Silent Hill's reality-questioning approach. Even games outside horror drew inspiration. The safe room concept appears in action games now. Inventory management influenced RPGs and looter shooters. Environmental storytelling through documents became standard across genres. The influence is so pervasive it's difficult to identify because it's been absorbed into gaming's design language. Both franchises also influenced each other. Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder camera became industry standard, influencing how later Silent Hill games approach perspective. Silent Hill's psychological depth pushed Resident Evil to explore more complex narratives in later entries. The franchises didn't just influence other games, they influenced each other, creating a feedback loop of design innovation. Iconic monster designs became cultural touchstones. Certain monsters from both franchises transcended the games to become cultural icons. Resident Evil zombies helped revive zombie popularity in early 21st century pop culture. Tyrants, particularly Mr. X and Nemesis, became instantly recognizable horror villains. Lickers with their exposed brains and grotesque tongues became synonymous with bio-horror. Silent Hill's Pyramid Head achieved similar, iconic status despite appearing primarily in one game. His triangular helmet, his massive blade, his role as executioner and sexual aggressor, all of it made him one of gaming's most recognizable horror figures. The nurses with their twitching movements and obscured faces became franchise symbols. The lying figures and mannequins carried deeply unsettling designs that stayed with players. These iconic designs succeeded because they were memorable, distinctive, and thematically resonant. They weren't just scary, they represented ideas. Zombies represented loss of humanity and unstoppable contamination. Pyramid Head represented guilt and sexual frustration. Each monster communicated something beyond surface appearance. The monsters' iconic status meant they appeared in crossover media, merchandise, and fan creations. They became shorthand for survival horror, instantly recognizable even to people who never played the games. This cultural penetration demonstrated both franchises' impact beyond gaming into broader pop culture consciousness. Religious symbolism and occult themes appeared throughout. Both franchises incorporated religious and occult symbolism, though to different degrees and purposes. Silent Hill leaned heavily into occultism through the Order, its attempts to birth God, its rituals and ceremonies. The town's power had spiritual dimensions, connected to Native American sacred ground corrupted by European settlers. Religious imagery appeared throughout: churches, angels, demons, apocalyptic visions. Resident Evil occasionally dabbled in religious themes, particularly in Resident Evil 4, with the Las Plagas parasites spreading through a religious cult. The Umbrella Corporation's God complex, attempting to create ultimate life forms, echoed religious narratives about humanity overreaching divine authority. But religion remained mostly aesthetic flavor rather than thematic core. These religious and occult elements served different purposes. For Silent Hill, they were essential to understanding the town's nature and history. For Resident Evil, they added atmospheric flavor to stories primarily driven by corporate conspiracy and scientific hubris. Silent Hill asked players to engage with religious symbolism to understand the narrative. Resident Evil used religious imagery as seasoning rather than main ingredient. Both approaches reflected broader horror traditions. Occult horror has deep roots in literature and film. Scientific horror represents modern anxieties about technology and progress. Silent Hill connected to the former, Resident Evil to the latter, though both occasionally borrowed from each other's toolkits. Limited voice acting created distinctive performances. Early entries in both franchises featured limited voice acting that became both notorious and beloved. Resident Evil's original dialogue was infamously bad. The master of unlocking, Jill Sandwich, you were almost a Jill Sandwich. Stiff delivery by actors seemingly reading English phonetically. The dialogue became meme-worthy, with fans quoting bad lines ironically and with genuine affection. Silent Hill's voice acting was more naturalistic, but still stilted by modern standards. The limitations came partly from translation issues, partly from early gaming voice directing standards, and partly from budget constraints limiting recording time. Performances ranged from adequate to wooden, with occasional moments of genuine emotion breaking through the stiffness. These performances became part of each franchise's charm. The stiff dialogue in Resident Evil contributed to its B-movie horror aesthetic, making it feel like the George Romero zombie films that inspired it. Silent Hill's occasionally awkward performances added to the dreamlike, off-kilter atmosphere where nothing felt quite right. The imperfections became features rather than bugs. Later entries improved voice acting as standards rose across the industry and budgets increased. Resident Evil remakes often re-recorded dialogue with better performances. Silent Hill 2's remake featured entirely new voice work, but fans remain divided. Some prefer the authentic awkwardness of original performances, while others appreciate professional voice acting's improved delivery. Water and bathrooms featured as consistently unsettling locations. Both franchises use water and bathroom spaces to create uniquely claustrophobic horror. Resident Evil featured aquatic monsters, including the Neptune sharks and later games' water-dwelling threats. Bathrooms and shower rooms appeared as places where zombies lurked or where horrific discoveries waited. Water represented contamination, the virus spreading through fluids, corruption, and decay. Silent Hill used water and bathrooms with more symbolic weight. The bathroom in the Otherworld school dripped with blood and filth. The hospital bathroom suggested infection, and bodily horror. Brookhaven Hospital's flooded basement created terrifying navigation challenges. Water represented drowning, suffocation, death, themes central to James's journey in Silent Hill 2. These spaces worked because they're simultaneously intimate and vulnerable locations. Bathrooms are private spaces where people are exposed and defenseless. Water obscures vision and restricts movement. Both franchises understood that making these familiar spaces horrific created deep unease. Horror works best when it corrupts the everyday. The aesthetic treatment of water differed between franchises. Resident Evil's water tended toward realistic pools, aquariums, sewers. Silent Hill's water was often abstract or impossible, blood raining from ceilings, tears streaming down walls, rust-colored liquid of ambiguous origin. But both used water to create environmental hazards and atmospheric horror. Health management systems created constant tension. Managing protagonist health was essential gameplay in both franchises. Resident Evil used a color-coded system: green, fine; yellow, caution; orange, danger; red, critical, with health visible through character status screens showing wounds and injuries. Healing required consuming herbs, first aid sprays, or combining items to create more potent remedies. Every healing item used was one less available for later, creating tension about when to heal versus when to endure. Silent Hill used similar systems with different specifics. Health was typically represented by a bar that depleted from damage. Healing items included health drinks and medical kits, with the latter being more potent but rarer. The games were generally more generous with healing items than Resident Evil, but combat was also more dangerous due to protagonist inexperience, balancing the equation differently. Both systems forced constant risk assessment. Do I heal now or wait until I'm more injured? Can I afford to use this healing item here, or might I need it more desperately later? Should I fight this enemy or run, knowing running preserves healing items but might lead to getting lost or trapped? These decisions created tension beyond immediate combat. They made players think tactically about resource expenditure across the entire game. Health management also connected to save systems. Resident Evil's ink ribbons created a three-way tension: health resources, save resources, and progress. Silent Hill's unlimited saves meant health was the primary resource, creating pressure. Both approaches worked because they made players feel under-resourced and vulnerable, never fully secure even in safe spaces. Backtracking through familiar spaces created evolving threat landscapes. Both franchises required extensive backtracking, forcing players to revisit areas as they unlocked new sections or retrieved necessary items. This could have been frustrating, but both games designed environments to change during backtracking, maintaining tension. Resident Evil spawned new enemies in previously cleared areas, or revealed new routes through familiar spaces. The mansion you thought you'd mastered continued presenting new challenges. Silent Hill used its fog world/otherworld transitions to completely transform spaces. You'd navigate the normal hospital, then return later to find it transformed into nightmare geometry. Familiar corridors became mazes of rust and blood. The backtracking felt fresh because the environments themselves changed, requiring relearning and re-navigation. This approach served multiple purposes. It maximized level design investment. Building detailed environments was expensive, so reusing them for backtracking made economic sense. It created a sense of place by keeping you in consistent locations, rather than constantly moving to entirely new areas. And it subverted player expectations. Just when you thought you'd mastered an area, it changed. The key was making backtracking feel purposeful rather than arbitrary. Both franchises usually gave you new tools or keys that unlocked previously inaccessible areas, making backtracking about progression rather than just retreading old ground. When backtracking felt pointless, just walking through empty areas to retrieve an item, it became frustrating. When it revealed new content or changed environments, it maintained engagement. Critical and commercial success defined their respective eras. Both franchises achieved massive success that validated survival horror as a commercially viable genre. Resident Evil sold over 2 million copies on PlayStation, making it a system seller and franchise cornerstone. Its success led directly to the development of Silent Hill, as Konami saw the market potential. Silent Hill couldn't match Resident Evil's raw sales numbers but achieved cult classic status and critical acclaim that established it as horror gaming's artistic counterpoint to Resident Evil's commercial dominance. This success encouraged publishers to invest in survival horror, leading to a genre boom in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Fatal Frame, Parasite Eve, Dino Crisis, Eternal Darkness, these and other franchises emerged in survival horror's wake, all drawing inspiration from what Resident Evil and Silent Hill established. The genre became one of gaming's most commercially reliable during this period. Critical reception varied between games, but both franchises received widespread acclaim at their peaks. Resident Evil 4 achieved near-universal critical praise and influenced action game design broadly. Silent Hill 2 is frequently cited among the greatest games ever made, studied in academic contexts for its narrative complexity and psychological depth. Both franchises proved horror games could achieve artistic recognition alongside commercial success. The ongoing commercial viability of both franchises, demonstrated through successful remakes and continued fan engagement, shows their lasting impact. 20 plus years after their PlayStation debuts, both remain relevant, playable, and capable of reaching new audiences. That longevity speaks to fundamental design strengths that transcended their technological origins. The horror-comedy balance created memorable tonal moments. Both franchises included moments of dark comedy, intentional or otherwise, that provided relief from relentless horror. Resident Evil's B-movie dialogue and over-the-top scenarios sometimes crossed into unintentional comedy. The franchise leaned into this with unlockable costumes and weapons, Chris in a Star's costume, infinite rocket launchers, the Tofu Survivor mode. These additions acknowledged the inherent absurdity alongside the horror. Silent Hill rarely broke tone during serious playthroughs but included elaborate joke endings as rewards for completion. The UFO endings featured aliens and tongue-in-cheek humor. Dog ending revealed that a Shiba Inu controlled the town's manifestations. These weren't canon but provided cathartic comedy after the psychological devastation of legitimate endings. The comedy elements served important functions. They prevented franchises from taking themselves too seriously, acknowledging the absurdity inherent in video game horror. They provided replay incentives through humorous unlockables. They gave players emotional release after intense horror experiences. And they built community through shared jokes and memorable moments that transcended the horror itself. Not everyone appreciated these tonal shifts. Some felt joke endings undermined Silent Hill's serious psychological horror. Some thought Resident Evil's campy elements prevented it from achieving genuine terror. but both franchises found audiences that valued the mixture of horror and humor, the ability to laugh at the absurdity while still experiencing genuine fear. Modding communities kept original games alive and evolved. Both franchises spawned active modding communities that extended games' lifespans far beyond official support. PC versions of Resident Evil games received mods adding new content, improving graphics, fixing bugs, and creating alternate experiences. Fan-made campaigns, texture overhauls, and quality of life improvements kept games playable and relevant years after release. Silent Hill's modding community focused heavily on restoration and preservation. Enhanced Edition mods for Silent Hill 2 PC restored effects and audio missing from the original port, essentially fixing a broken PC release through community effort. These mods became essential for experiencing the game as intended on modern hardware. The modding communities demonstrated passionate fan investment beyond passive consumption. Players became creators, extending and improving games they loved. These communities also served preservation functions, keeping games playable when official support ended and hardware obsolescence threatened accessibility. Both franchises occasionally incorporated community feedback into official releases. The Silent Hill 2 remake acknowledged Enhanced Edition mods' popularity by implementing similar fixes officially. Resident Evil remakes sometimes incorporated community-requested features. This dialogue between fans and developers enriched both franchises, creating feedback loops where community engagement influenced official development. Voice acting quality dramatically improved over time. The journey from early stiff performances to modern professional voice acting tracked both franchises' evolution and the gaming industry's maturation. Early Resident Evil games featured notoriously poor voice work, with actors seemingly reading English phonetically without understanding context or emotion. The infamous Master of Unlocking line became a meme representing early gaming voice work's limitations. Silent Hill's original voice work was more competent but still limited by budget and directing constraints. Performances ranged from adequate to occasionally wooden, with Harry Mason's delivery sometimes lacking emotional conviction that his situation warranted. As gaming matured and budgets increased, voice acting quality improved dramatically. Resident Evil 4 featured significantly better performances with more naturalistic delivery. Silent Hill 3 employed more professional voice directing, resulting in Heather's convincing performance. Later entries in both franchises featured full performance capture, motion capture, and Hollywood-level production values for voice work. The remakes of both franchises completely re-recorded dialogue with modern standards. Resident Evil 2 Remake featured performances that conveyed genuine terror and personality. Silent Hill 2 Remake offered entirely new voice acting that divided fans. Some preferred the original's slight awkwardness as part of the aesthetic. Others appreciated professional delivery. This evolution reflected gaming's broader shift from niche hobby to mainstream entertainment. Voice acting went from afterthought to central component of game production, with professional voice actors and directors becoming industry standards. Both franchises rode this wave, improving dramatically over time, while their earliest entries' charming stiffness became nostalgic artifacts. Urban and rural isolation created different types of horror. Both franchises explored isolation but in different contexts. Resident Evil often used rural isolation. The Spencer Mansion stood in remote mountains, accessible only by helicopter. Later games continued this pattern with isolated villages, remote islands, and secluded facilities. The isolation was geographical. Civilization was far away. Help couldn't arrive quickly. You were trapped in remote locations with limited resources. Silent Hill used urban isolation. The town itself was the prison. Ostensibly a normal resort town, Silent Hill became sealed off from the outside world during the otherworld manifestations. Fog prevented seeing more than a few feet ahead even in open streets. The isolation was psychological and supernatural rather than purely geographical. The town trapped protagonists through its supernatural power. These different approaches to isolation created distinct horror flavors. Rural isolation suggested vulnerability. Help was genuinely unreachable. You were truly alone. Urban isolation suggested wrongness. Towns shouldn't be empty, streets shouldn't be silent. The absence of people in populated spaces created uncanny dread. Both worked because isolation removes safety nets and forces self-reliance. The isolation also served practical gameplay functions. It explained why protagonists couldn't just leave or call for help. It justified limited resources and lack of support. It created contained environments where horror could escalate without external interruption. Both franchises needed isolation for their survival horror to function mechanically and narratively. Family trauma and personal demons drove character motivations. While Resident Evil focused more on external threats, both franchises explored personal trauma as narrative motivation. Resident Evil characters often had tragic backstories or lost family members that drove their involvement. Leon Kennedy's dead girlfriend, Chris and Claire searching for each other, Ada's complex loyalties, personal connections motivated characters beyond just escaping monsters. Silent Hill made personal trauma and family dysfunction central to its narratives. Harry searched for his lost daughter. James dealt with his wife's death and his role in it. Heather discovered her true identity and confronted family legacy. Angela, Eddie, and other supporting characters in Silent Hill 2 each carried massive psychological burdens that the town manifested. The horror was inseparable from personal demons. This focus on character motivation distinguished survival horror from pure monster movies. The protagonists weren't just fighting external threats, they were confronting internal conflicts manifested externally. Resident Evil did this subtly through character relationships and backstory. Silent Hill made it explicit through symbolism and manifestation. The emphasis on personal stakes created emotional investment beyond simple survival. You weren't just trying to escape. You were trying to rescue someone, uncover truth, confront guilt, or achieve some personal resolution. The monsters and environment were obstacles, but the real journey was internal. Both franchises understood that horror works best when it's personal, when characters have something to lose beyond just their lives. Pharmaceutical horror and medical experimentation themes. Medical horror threaded through both franchises, though expressed differently. Resident Evil made pharmaceutical companies' unethical experimentation central to its premise. Umbrella Corporation developed bioweapons under the guise of pharmaceutical research. Hospitals and laboratories featured prominently as locations where human experiments occurred. The horror came from corporate disregard for human life in pursuit of profit and power. Silent Hill featured hospitals as primary locations but focused more on psychological associations with medical spaces. Brookhaven Hospital in Silent Hill 2 manifested James's memories of Mary's illness and his resentment toward her suffering. The hospital became a nightmare space reflecting guilt and sexual frustration. Alchemilla Hospital in the first game mixed cult experimentation with occult horror. Medical spaces worked for horror because they're liminal, places between life and death, health and sickness. They contain suffering and healing, hope and despair. Both franchises exploited these associations. Resident Evil made medical institutions villainous, their healing mission corrupted into weapon development. Silent Hill made medical spaces personal hells, reflecting characters' traumas associated with illness and death. The medical experimentation themes also served as social commentary. Resident Evil critiqued corporate greed and the military-industrial complex willingness to weaponize anything. Silent Hill explored how medical institutions, meant to heal, can become sources of trauma through their inevitable associations with suffering and mortality. Both franchises use medical horror to explore deeper anxieties about institutions meant to help us. The Japanese horror influence shaped both franchises. While Resident Evil drew heavily from Western zombie films and action movies, both franchises were fundamentally Japanese horror games, influenced by Japanese horror cinema and cultural anxieties. Silent Hill particularly showed J-horror influence through its emphasis on psychological horror, ambiguous reality, and symbolic monsters. The fog, the rust, the industrial decay, these aesthetic choices reflected Japanese horror cinema's tendency toward atmospheric dread over explicit violence. Resident Evil incorporated J-horror elements more subtly. The emphasis on slow-building tension, the use of children as frightening figures, the corporate conspiracy elements. These reflected Japanese anxiety about corporate power and social conformity. The biological horror, while inspired by Western zombie films, was filtered through Japanese sensibilities about contamination and collective responsibility. The cultural context influenced how horror was deployed. Japanese horror often emphasizes the inescapability of curse or contamination. There's no escape once marked. Both franchises incorporated this through their manifestation mechanics and viral spread concepts. Silent Hill's town called to people with darkness in their hearts. Resident Evil's T-virus spread inexorably once released. Neither allowed for easy escape once horror began. Understanding these franchises' Japanese origins helps explain design choices that sometimes puzzled Western audiences. The slower pacing, the emphasis on atmosphere over constant action, the willingness to leave mysteries unexplained, these reflected Japanese horror traditions. Both franchises were Japanese developers' interpretations of horror, filtered through their cultural context, even when borrowing from Western sources. Time-limited challenges and rankings added competitive elements. Both franchises incorporated speedrun-friendly design and ranking systems that encourage mastery and competition. Resident Evil ranked your performance based on completion time, saves used, and other factors. Complete the game fast enough without saving excessively, and you received A rankings and unlockable rewards. This created replayability for players seeking optimal runs. Silent Hill employed similar ranking systems, grading players on multiple factors: combat efficiency, puzzle-solving speed, damage taken, all contributed to final rankings. The UFO and dog endings often required specific actions that speedrunners learned to execute precisely. Rankings and time-based unlockables encouraged players to master games thoroughly. These competitive elements attracted different player types than the narrative-focused horror. Speedrunners found deep wells of optimization potential. Completionists sought to achieve perfect rankings on all difficulties. The rankings added longevity beyond story completion, creating communities around optimal play and route planning. The time-limited challenge aspects might seem antithetical to horror. Rushing through environments undermines atmospheric tension, but both franchises managed to maintain horror on first playthroughs while offering optimization challenges for subsequent runs. This dual nature, horror game and score attack challenge, broadened appeal and extended playability. Environmental hazards beyond enemies created additional threats. Both franchises featured environmental hazards that killed or damaged players independently of enemies. Resident Evil had explosive barrels, electrical hazards, crushing traps, and poison gases. Navigating environments required attention to surroundings beyond just enemy positions. Traps in the Spencer Mansion punished careless movement. Silent Hill featured pits that appeared in otherworld floors, requiring careful navigation. Rust-covered grating sometimes gave way, dropping players into lower areas. Environmental hazards were less frequent than in Resident Evil, but served similar purposes, making environments themselves threatening, not just the monsters within them. These hazards forced spatial awareness and careful movement. You couldn't just sprint through areas, you had to watch for environmental threats while also tracking enemies. This layered different types of threats, increasing overall tension. The environment itself became hostile, not just a neutral space where combat occurred. Environmental storytelling often accompanied these hazards. Traps in Resident Evil suggested the mansion's true purpose before explicit reveals. Collapsing floors in Silent Hill emphasized the otherworld's instability and decay. Hazards weren't just mechanical obstacles, they contributed to atmosphere and narrative. Photo and screenshot modes encouraged documentation. Later entries in both franchises incorporated photography mechanics, or screenshot modes that encouraged players to document their experiences. These features served multiple purposes beyond simple photo collection. They encouraged environmental observation, slowed pacing, and created shareable moments that built community engagement. Photography mechanics sometimes served gameplay functions. Taking pictures of specific objects or locations might unlock bonus content or provide hints for puzzles. This transformed photo modes from purely cosmetic features into gameplay systems that rewarded exploration and attention to detail. The ability to capture and share horror moments built community engagement around both franchises. Players shared screenshots of particularly terrifying encounters, beautiful environmental details, or humorous moments. This social aspect extended game's reach beyond individual play sessions into shared cultural experiences. Photo modes also reflected gaming's evolution towards cinematic presentation. Players wanted to capture dramatic moments, beautiful environments, or disturbing imagery. Both franchises recognized this desire and eventually incorporated official tools for documentation and sharing. Conclusion: two pillars supporting the same roof. 100 connections, 100 threads weaving through fog-shrouded streets and virus-infected mansions, some obvious, others subtle, some mechanical, others thematic. Together they tell a story larger than either franchise alone, the story of survival, horror's birth, evolution, and lasting impact on gaming. Resident Evil and Silent Hill arrived at survival horror from different directions. One brought zombies and conspiracies, action beats and resource management. The other brought manifestations and symbolism, atmosphere and psychological devastation. But both understood fundamental truths about horror in interactive media. Vulnerability creates tension, atmosphere builds dread, scarcity forces difficult choices, and personal stakes transform escape attempts into emotional journeys. They learned from each other. They competed with each other. They pushed each other to evolve. When Resident Evil succeeded with action horror, Silent Hill doubled down on psychological complexity. When Silent Hill demonstrated atmospheric storytelling, Resident Evil incorporated more character depth. The competition elevated both, creating a feedback loop of innovation that benefited the entire survival horror genre. Their influence extends far beyond themselves. Walk through the corridors of Dead Space's Ishimura, and you see Resident Evil's DNA in every resource management decision. Wander The Last of Us's abandoned cities, and Silent Hill's atmospheric horror echoes in every environmental detail. Modern survival horror exists because these two franchises established the genre's vocabulary, grammar, and possibilities. They remain relevant decades after their debut because they understood something essential. Horror works best when it connects to deeper anxieties. Resident Evil's corporate conspiracy taps into fears about institutional power and uncontrolled science. Silent Hill's psychological manifestations explore guilt, trauma, and repressed emotions. Both franchises recognize that monsters are most frightening when they represent something beyond themselves. 29 years have passed since that mansion outside Raccoon City opened its doors. 26 years since that foggy resort town welcomed Harry Mason. Both franchises have changed, evolved, stumbled, and recovered. They've been remade, reimagined, and reinvented for new generations. But their fundamental appeal remains constant. They make us feel vulnerable, under-resourced, and uncertain whether we'll survive. They make us confront horrors, external and internal. They prove that video games can be as terrifying, meaningful, and memorable as any horror film or novel. These 100 commonalities don't diminish what makes each franchise unique. Resident Evil's action horror remains distinct from Silent Hill's psychological terror, but recognizing their shared foundation helps us appreciate how two different approaches to survival horror can both succeed, both influence gaming broadly, and both remain vital parts of horror's ongoing evolution. The fog hasn't lifted, the virus hasn't been cured, and somewhere in a dark room lit only by screen glow, a new player encounters these franchises for the first time, beginning their own journey through fog and infection, discovering why survival horror matters, and why these two particular horrors have endured when so many others faded into obscurity. 100 things in common, two franchises, one genre they helped create, and countless players who face their fears in Spencer Mansion's halls and Silent Hill's streets, emerging changed by the experience. The radio crackles with static. Somewhere nearby, something shuffles toward you, and you realize you're almost out of ammunition, low on healing items, far from any save point. This is survival horror. This is what Resident Evil and Silent Hill built together.